Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. And so I want to thank you all again for coming to the 2022 MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference, Competitive Advantage Talk, presented by Kager, also known as the Craft Analytics Group. My name is Nahom Brahane, and I'm a first-year MBA student here at MIT. And it is my pleasure to introduce the presentation, The Rooney Rule. Let's change the conversation. And please help me welcome Chris Ryder, Associate Professor of Strategy, Ross School of Business.
Thank you, Nahom. All right, hello everyone. It's great to be here today. Thank you for the introduction, Nahom. I am Chris Ryder, Associate Professor of Strategy and the Thomas C. Kinnear Professor at the University of Michigan. I teach a course on equity analytics and do work on racial disparity in sports. And for my presentation today, it'll show up soon. All right, good, I'm ready now. All right, so for the presentation today, it's about changing the conversation about the Rooney Rule. And let me be clear, I think that racial disparity in sports is a conversation we should all continue to have. What I'd like to try and encourage you to think about is how we might change the conversation specifically about the Rooney Rule and whether or not it works. All right. So let's start with a tradition here in the U.S. Every year in the U.S. at the turn of the new year, January comes along and we make some resolutions. We're going to eat healthier. We're going to exercise more, right? We celebrate the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday and progress in racial relationships in the U.S. Now, for NFL fans, there's a different tradition. There's the playoffs. And every week, more and more NFL fans lament the fact that their team will not win the Super Bowl this year. Now, if you're in New York, that actually starts several months earlier every year. We're in Boston, come on. All right. There's another tradition in the US, all right, and that's the coaching carousel. The coaching carousel starts, all right? We see coaches get fired. We see someone else get hired, and we start to discuss who's getting hired, who's getting fired. And specifically, the question comes up, why are there not more head coaches of color in the NFL? We've had a Rooney Rule that is designed to address this issue for nearly 2 decades now. Yet we still have the same conversation every year. And today, what I'd like to do is take the first step in trying to change the conversation we have every year. I'll have a proposal for you. But first, let's start with, does the Rooney Rule work? All right, this is an analytical crowd, so I brought some data. All right, and this is just the representation of head coaches of color over time. All right, from 2003 when the Rooney Rule was implemented, pre and post. Now, first pass at analytics, we look at the pre-post comparison of that line, and we see that that slope has indeed changed, that there has been an increase in representation after the Rooney Rule was implemented. All right, there are more head coaches of color proportionally than there were prior to the Rooney Rule. That's unambiguous. And so some people point to that and say, the rule has been an uncharted success. Others will look at the variation, the change on a year-to-year basis, and when it starts trending downward, they will instead say, the rule seems to have lost whatever effectiveness it once had. It's not working anymore. It did at first, but not anymore. All right? Others will say, well, we shouldn't just look at just 1 year. Instead, we should look at the full trend. Right? If we draw the best fitting line here, well, we might look at it and say there's no debating that the Rooney Rule's had a positive impact in the NFL. We weren't even discussing many of these issues prior to the Rooney Rule's implementation, or at least not publicly or in broad circles. Now, others look at this and say, look, the rule is actually fine. We're debating the wrong thing, and really what we need is change in the people making these decisions. All right? And so there's a lot of debate, and we have this debate every single year about the time when coaches are getting fired and hired. And I think it's an important discussion to have. What I'd like to do is change the nature of that conversation. All right? So how could we do that? All right? Well, what if we change the conversation so next year I come back here. Yeah, I'm inviting myself home. We've determined whether or not the Rooney Rule works. All right? Next year, instead of saying, hey, does this thing still work? We say, what's next? All right? I think we can do this. And if we do, these guys will surely find something else to argue about. All right? So what I would like to do is, what if we were to do the analytical study, the research that is necessary to say, this does or does not work, and these are the conditions under which it works best if it does. That would be a much better conversation to have. And I think we can do this. So I've got a modest proposal for folks out here. I know you work in sports franchises, hire lots of people. I've got a proposal for you to consider, all right? Let's first start, though, with let's go back to the analytics for a second, all right? Here's why it's hard to answer that question, does the Rooney Rule work, with what we got, okay? If we look at the time trend, all right, that's that same head coaches of color representation figure in the red, all right? That black dashed line, however, is the pipeline. That's the representation of assistant coaches in the NFL. And so when we look at that, we see that it's not clear that the Rooney Rule achieves something that would not have been achieved in the absence of the Rooney Rule. We have to invent sort of a counterfactual scenario, an alternative universe in which the Rooney Rule never happened. And we need to draw that line out, but we also need to take into account the fact that the assistant coach pipeline is also diversifying, and we don't want to overlook that, all right? Now, in trying to estimate that counterfactual, to imagine that other scenario, well, we have a problem here, which is that every year it's a handful, sometimes it's 2 handfuls of jobs that turn over every year, okay? It's also a uniform implementation. Every hiring organization is subject to the same rule, all right? So we don't have a natural A/B test here. And we have to take into account that the pipeline is indeed diversifying, and we should have expected some increase in that representation figure, regardless of whether or not the Rooney Rule has worked, okay? So that's our challenge, all right? And if we continue to try and analyze the data, and trust me, I spend years analyzing this data, we can do it all sorts of ways. I can show you a counterfactual that makes the Rooney Rule look great. I can make a slight tweak to that and make it look like the Rooney Rule does not look great, all right? And we really don't want something so important to be subject to such arbitrary assumptions. All right? So here's the research I've done, okay? And so what we have here is the white coach advantage and promotion rates over a 3-decade period in the NFL. We have evidence of racial disparity in the NFL. We don't need to analyze the Rooney Rule to do that. So with my co-authors, Jim Wade at George Washington, Anand Swaminathan at Emory, and Andreas Schwab at Iowa State, all right? We have collected data on all assistant coaches, not just the head coaches, all the way down to the assistant to the position and the quality control coaches over a 3-decade period. All right? We followed their careers. We coded the position they played in college, the position where they started the career, where they work now. And thanks to the analytics community, we got about 50 different performance metrics we can include in our analyses as well. So thank you all for that. All right? And so we follow them. Okay? And what you see there in the gray columns are multipliers of the baseline rate of promotion, where 1.0 is parity, and as you can see, across different specifications, we're seeing something between, a 40 to 90% advantage for white coaches in getting promoted to the next level. Okay? And that,
Is it years or position?
I'm sorry?
What's the x-axis?
Those are different progressions, different regression specifications. So more restrictive as you go left to right. Thank you. All right. So what this is showing, once we control for coaches who played the same position, coaches who started their career in the same position, coaches who currently coach the same position, they perform equivalently by a wide host of metrics. They have the same level of experience. We control for things like their network. Do you have kin, all right, family members who are coaching in the NFL? How about your networks, people you used to coach with who are at other franchises? We control for all of these, all right? And when we get down to it, we see in our analyses that there is no racial disparity in the promotion from coordinator to head coach, right? And this is very surprising because the Rooney Rule, when it was implemented, was specifically designed to address promotions to head coach. The challenge that our analyses has demonstrated is that the challenge is in getting to that coordinator job that's held 79% of head coach promotions are from the coordinator position. And in that, the white coaches have a promotion advantage that's about 90%. All right, that's very large. If I were to find another organization where it was that large, I would be quite shocked. All right, and so the analyses that we did demonstrate that the challenge is in getting the qualifications necessary to be considered for a head coaching position. And so early on in this research, we took this research to Cyrus Mary, who's the Rooney Rule pioneer with Johnny Cochran Jr., and also an advisor for the Fritz Pollard Alliance. And we took it to Cyrus and we said, look, the Rooney Rule, we don't know if it's effective. Can't tell you that. All right. But what we can say, if you think it's effective, it should be applied at a lower level. All right. And so Cyrus has been, a tireless advocate for strengthening the Rooney Rule, for modifying it as necessary. He went to the NFL owners and persuaded them to first apply the Rooney Rule to the coordinator position informally in 2016, and then formally in 2019, an additional strengthening of the rule over time. So our research has been covered on ESPN. Mina Kimes was the first reporter to pick it up and did a wonderful story on this. I've written a case study about Cyrus and the Rooney Rule, which I teach in my equity analytics course. All right. So I've thought a lot about this and had many conversations. Cyrus comes and speaks in my class about how we might reimagine the rule. All right. And so this is my contribution to that discussion. All right. I know we got the craft folks here. All right. What if we change the conversation? I really believe we can do this, and I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment. Now, what if we had the Rooney Rule for team jobs? All right. We had receptionist and digital video editor, and we applied the Rooney Rule in a way that we know, after these teams hire, whether or not the Rooney Rule has changed the composition of the workforce. All right. That is, these teams employ hundreds, maybe thousands of people every year across all their operations. What if we did this in a way that we just compare the composition of those jobs subject to the Rooney Rule to those that were not? What I'm proposing here is an A/B test. We'd have a clear counterfactual. We don't have to have someone like me come up with a bunch of rhetorical counterfactuals and make the lines go together or go apart, all right? We do an A/B test where, say, by random, every other job, all right, or a randomly selected job gets the A condition. That's the treatment. The Rooney Rule is applied. The other ones, they get the B condition. The Rooney Rule is not applied. I tell you what, you've got 32 NFL franchises. You hire a few hundred people across each one each year. We know this time next year whether or not the Rooney Rule works. All right. We don't need to apply it to head coaching positions and be subject to small numbers bias. We don't want to have a uniform implementation. We want to do something like this. And I'm looking for the organization willing to try it. We'll know then, does the Rooney Rule work? It's a pretty straightforward test. We don't need the analytics crowd to do this. This is a difference in means test, all right? This is just more personnel of color hired in A than in B. If so, yes, the rule works. If not, no, it doesn't. Let's try something else, all right? And then we can argue, of course, about whether or not it applies to receptionists and digital video assistants just as well as it does to coordinator positions. And I'm happy to have that discussion because at least we've acknowledged that something works, and it's just a matter of identifying the conditions under which it works best, all right? So here's my proposal. This is my collaborator, Ray Reagans. Ray and I are doing several studies together, one with a large technology company, another one with a governing body of an Olympic sport, where we're investigating racial disparity in attainment and career progression, all right? This is our analytics. This is our sport, all right? And so Ray and I have a proposal for you. If your organization, if an NFL franchise or another sports organization wants to do this, we're available, no charge. We will design the A/B test for you. We will design the logistics. We'll analyze the data, and we can come back here next year and tell people whether or not the Rooney Rule works. If you're in, then we're in with you, all right? That's what we would like, all right? So if you're out there, I'm going to be here all day. I hope to see you around the halls, all right? I think the NFL should do this, all right? I think the commissioner has said, it's not good enough. Everything's on the table. I think that the NFL owners could make the decision to do this, and they don't have to do it with the coaching staffs. It'd be great if they did, all right? But I think that they could actually get greater numbers in most of their operations, and I think that's the real opportunity here. I think this is the opportunity for the NFL to show that they're better than their record, all right? I could go into a whole host of sports cliches here. I'll avoid that for the moment, all right? But if the NFL does fumble this opportunity, well, there are many places you can do this. It doesn't have to be in an NFL franchise, all right? We could go to the NBA, all right? We've got Mark Cuban down in Dallas, all right? If he wants to make a run at the greatest owner of all time, all right, he could do the Rooney Rule in the Dallas Mavericks organization, all right? Some of the companies he works with. We can see next year, all right? And if Mark doesn't want to do this, well, if we're going to call Mark Cuban the greatest owner of all time in the NBA, there's a guy down in Charlotte who might not like that so much, all right? If we're going to talk about the greatest of all time, well, maybe MJ wants to be the greatest owner of all time. Maybe he'd like to run this down in Charlotte. And so MJ, we've all seen what happens when you take it personal. All right. So if you want to take this one personal, we're there for you. We'll come down to Charlotte, run this with you. All right. I'd love it if we walked away from today's session with some conversations with some of you, with those you know. I think this is such an important topic, and we're so close to knowing whether or not the Rooney Rule works if we just do a study or a few studies that answer the question in a way that the analytics crowd here and society writ large can really buy. So I'll be here all day. Let's change the conversation together. Thank you. I'm glad to take questions as well. Yes. Oh, we got to get you the mic. That's right.
Yeah, appreciate it. Have you done any research into not just the opportunities, but the qualities of the opportunities? Because, to give an example, the Houston Texans in the last 2 years have hired 2 different minority head coaches, but haven't really made any progress to put them in winning situations. Yeah. So it seems like they're being set up for failure. So have you done any research into this side of the Rooney Rule?
Yeah, there is a lot of academic research. I appreciate the question. On what's called the glass cliff phenomenon. That is, those who face disadvantages in labor markets or organizations are more likely to take positions where they're less likely to succeed than others. And this often happens not just with race, but with respect to gender and other social identity differences. And so we examined this in the NFL. All right, we looked if coaches of color were getting promoted into teams with lower performance than the year prior, based on number of statistics, including winning percentage. We also looked at their performance in the year after they were hired, and we saw no significant difference. Now that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, and I think the Texans is an example one could argue is certainly a good one. But in large numbers, we don't see evidence of a glass cliff phenomenon in the NFL. We see something different, and that's differential rates of advancement through the ranks. And if we want to address that, well, it makes sense to start that at the lowest level positions where people start their careers. You have the most opportunities to level the playing field that way. Thank you. Other questions, please? Yes, we've got 2 over here.
Hi, my name is Jackie Lovett. I actually worked as the assistant to the head coach for coach at the New York Jets. So for Coach Bowles, Coach Gase, and then Coach Sala. So I spent 6 years with 3 different head coaches there. And I wanted to ask you, so I don't have a lot of, my knowledge in college sports isn't great, but is there something similar to this in college sports, and can you do an A/B out of like different leagues or conferences that do it in college? Is there any data there?
Yeah, that's a natural analysis to do. I think you're right. That we would want to see how the NFL compares to the NCAA. No university has done an A/B test. I've gone down the road with several of them trying to talk. Usually the general counsel's office decides that's not what we're doing here. There have been studies, however, that have compared the NFL to the NCAA. Those are subject to the same kinds of assumptions that I would make. These studies use what's called a synthetic controls estimate, where they try and do weighted average counterfactuals based on, well, how about what was the Big Ten like? What was the Pac-12 like? And we can make similar trend lines, project them out to compare the actual trend. My argument would be that we don't really know what would have happened, and that's so subject to assumption that this is just too important to not do an A/B test.
Mm-hmm. Do some colleges have like Rooney Rule like equivalents at those levels?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Not necessarily in sports, but in promotion decisions or personnel decisions writ large. The Rooney Rule is the world's most prominent DEI initiative. It's been adopted by companies like Amazon, Facebook, the city of Portland. There are cricket leagues in the UK that have a Rooney Rule. So yeah, yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So I know the Rooney Rule was really effective, but it gets people through the door. I know one initiative that came out recently, and going back to the Culley argument, was when the Ravens were able to place him in a position to be a head coach, they got compensated. And we as humans respond very well to incentives. So I'm curious what your thoughts are, besides the Rooney Rule, of incentivizing the promotion process.
Yeah, thank you. So the original fair competition resolution that Cyrus Mehri and Johnny Cochran Jr. proposed back in 2002 had a whole series of rewards and sanctions as part of their proposal, including draft picks and penalties, right? Forfeiting draft picks in some cases. That ultimately was not passed, though in recent years we've seen some variation of that come into play. I think that, my conversations with Cyrus Mehri suggest that the Rooney Rule works best when the league is enforcing it to its full extent. We draw the comparison between the Detroit Lions back in the early days of the rule, when Matt Millen and the Lions were fined a large amount for not following the spirit of the law. And we compare that to the Raiders when John Gruden was hired, and Mark Davis targeted John Gruden before and really went through what we would call probably a sham interview process. So giving draft picks for franchises that produce coaches of color who get promoted seems to be a good policy, right? It seems to be one that, if the problem is that teams are denying coaches of color opportunities to interview, the draft picks will help incentivize them to give permission. If the issue is developing people or trying to hold them back so they don't go, right, well, the draft picks should help compensate that. And it seems like if it's a worthwhile incentive, given that draft picks have greater value than cash in the NFL. Yeah. Okay, we've got a few here.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is, how do you tease out other variables to get it to reduce down to race? Is that through regression? How would you tease out gender, education, background, experience?
Yeah, it's complicated. We do it the best we can. We use multivariate regressions. In this case, by definition of the sample during our time period, there are no women, so we can rule out gender by design. We identify race, we use human coders, multiple coders, to rate pictures and biographies. And our assumption there is that what really matters is the social identity, the way people see a person, rather than any biological differences. So we've done, to the best of our ability, the measurement things we can do. We've used multivariate regression. We use a technique to estimate that it's possible that we've omitted something from our regression specification. Our analysis suggests that omitted variable would have to be 4 times as influential as race before we can conclude that there is not a racial disadvantage here. And that's probably the best we can do. But I think it's still pretty powerful. Thank you. There was another question back here.
Somewhat similar to the last question, I was just curious what your thoughts on the result differentials between, doing this test on, say, the NFL, where there would probably be less women to control for, versus, say, the WNBA, even if you were controlling for gender. What are your thoughts on, how that would play into the results?
I think that you don't need a gender homogeneous sample to do this. In fact, so long as the sample is large enough, more diversity is better. So I think that it could be done in the WNBA. There you have the challenge of fewer franchises, but you could also learn something about gender diversity. You could have a Rooney Rule for race and one for gender, and for other social identity differences. And that's why I think that doing this for the franchise jobs, the operations, as opposed to the coaching staff, is really the way to go, because that's your chance to get large N. And if we just do head coaching or coordinator jobs, we're always going to be subject to small numbers bias every year. Thank you. Okay, I see some back here. No, hold on. We've got time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay.
Who was it?
Whoever you, yeah. Let's do it, yeah.
Yeah, great presentation. curious, have you evaluated the data to understand disparities in firing rates between the racial groups?
We have not recently, and that reason is that we have additional small numbers issues there. The low representation of head coaches of color gives us low numbers to see the rate of firing. And so you can do that, but you're really just doing that in a descriptive sense, conditional probabilities. Regression specifications aren't really your friend. You can't control for a whole lot. I do know that prior to the Rooney Rule, Janice Madden did a study and showed that the small number of coaches of color who were hired prior to the Rooney Rule, there seemed to be a disparity. They were fired with better records. That disparity went away after the Rooney Rule. And so she has concluded that the Rooney Rules address that differential firing, though I think anecdotally, that's another part of the conversation we can have every year. So thank you, appreciate the question. Thank you all, and I hope I get to talk to some of you today.